The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. These words by Marcel Proust are more relevant today than ever before, especially when we talk about the ever-present topic of ethics. Hi, I'm Daisy, and welcome to a special episode of Advanced Podcast Series, where we don't just scratch the surface, but venture far beneath to uncover layers of meaning that are often overlooked. If you're here to question the world around you, to challenge the norms, and to explore the intricate web of morality, then you're in the right place.
And I'm Liam. Today, we're going to take you on a journey through the landscape of ethical dilemmas, those moments in life when there isn't an obvious right or wrong. We're not going to spoon-feed you answers, but instead we'll explore the complexity of ethical decision-making in a way that challenges not only your logic, but your values. Stick with us until the end. We promise that you'll leave with new perspectives, and maybe, just maybe, you'll find yourself questioning your own moral compass in ways you never expected.
Before we plunge into the specifics, let's define what we mean by an ethical dilemma. An ethical dilemma isn't just a difficult decision. It's a choice between two conflicting moral principles, where adhering to one leads to the violation of another. It's like the myth of Odysseus navigating between Scylla and Charybdis. Whichever path he chooses, something of value will be sacrificed.
Exactly. Think about the trolley problem, one of the most famous ethical dilemmas posed by philosopher Philip Foot. You stand at the switch of a train track. On one side, there are 5 people tied to the tracks, and on the other, just one. You have the power to pull the lever and divert the train, saving the 5 but killing the 1. What do?
It's a question that reveals the tension between utilitarianism, the belief that the morally right action is the one that maximizes overall happiness, and deontological ethics, which argues that some actions, like killing, are always wrong no matter the consequences.
Let's pause here and really dig into some of the vocabulary. Utilitarianism, a concept pioneered by philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, suggests that the greater good is the guiding force of morality. But this idea isn't just theoretical. It shows up in everyday situations. Imagine a public health official during a pandemic deciding how to allocate scarce vaccines. Do they distribute them based on a person's age, their social role, or their likelihood of survival? Each approach has its utilitarian rationale.
On the other hand, deontology, the ethical theory most associated with Immanuel Kant, suggests that morality is about following rules, regardless of the outcome. Kant believed that there are categorical imperatives, absolute moral laws, like do not lie or do not kill. Even in the face of overwhelming consequences, these laws hold firm. A classic literary example of this is in Sophocles' Antigone, where the protagonist must choose between obeying the state's law or the moral duty to her brother. It's a conflict between external law and internal morality.
And we can't ignore the role of virtue ethics, a concept traced back to Aristotle. It's less about rules and more about character. A person facing an ethical dilemma might ask, what would a virtuous person do in this situation? It's about striving to be a person of integrity, honesty, courage, someone who practices phronesis or practical wisdom.
These are not just abstract ideas. They influence the choices we make in the workplace, in relationships, and even in moments of personal crisis. And that's why learning the vocabulary of ethics isn't just about acquiring words. It's about sharpening the tools you'll use to navigate your own moral landscape. Ethical dilemmas aren't confined to philosophy books. They're everywhere in our culture. Take The Dark Knight, directed by Christopher Nolan. There's that unforgettable scene where Batman must choose between saving Harvey Dent or Rachel Dawes. It's a literal and moral ticking time bomb. What makes this film a fascinating case study is that it forces us to wrestle with the idea of the moral hero. Is Batman's adherence to his code of never killing always justifiable?
That's a great example. And it makes me think of something even deeper: how ethical dilemmas shape characters in fiction. Think about Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, where Raskolnikov justifies his murder of an old pawnbroker as a utilitarian act. After all, he reasons, her death will free him to do greater good for society. But as the novel unfolds, we see that the price of that moral rationalization is not just the life of the pawnbroker, but Raskolnikov's own soul.
These stories force us to confront our own beliefs. Could we justify our actions if we were in their shoes? It's easy to say no when we're spectators, but dilemmas in real life are never so clear-cut. Take the movie The Imitation Game, where Alan Turing must decide whether to let a small number of people die by keeping the Nazi enigma, code-breaking a secret, or save them and risk revealing their advantage. His decision ultimately saved millions, but it also left him carrying the moral burden of those deaths.
What's fascinating is how these dilemmas show up in the real world. One of the most debated topics today is artificial intelligence and autonomous vehicles. What should a self-driving car do in an unavoidable accident situation? Should it prioritize the safety of its passengers or pedestrians? This dilemma is real, immediate, and in many ways echoes the trolley problem.
It raises the question of responsibility. Who's to blame if an autonomous vehicle chooses to harm someone? The programmer, the manufacturer, the person who bought the car. This leads us into discussions of ethical responsibility in technology, a field that's evolving faster than we can set ethical guidelines.
This brings us to another key word: accountability. In a world driven by tech and innovation, how do we ensure accountability in systems where the moral agent is no longer human, but algorithmic?
Let's take a moment to really think about words like accountability and responsibility. These words often get thrown around interchangeably, but in ethics, they carry distinct meanings. Accountability is about being answerable to others. It's an external force. Responsibility, on the other hand, is an internal obligation, a personal commitment to act ethically.
That's right. And then there's the word culpability, which takes things a step further. Culpability means being morally or legally to blame for an action. In discussions around ethics, the line between culpability and responsibility can become incredibly blurry. For instance, think about war crimes. Can a soldier following orders ever be truly culpable, or does responsibility fall on the system that commands them?
And this question brings us naturally into the relationship between law and ethics. Just because something is legal, does that make it ethical? Think of the novel 1984 by George Orwell, where oppressive surveillance and control are lawful in the totalitarian state. The government operates within its own legal framework, but the morality of these actions is obviously questionable.
Absolutely. The law is a reflection of societal values at a given time, but it doesn't always align with what's morally just. Look at the historical context of slavery, once legal, now universally condemned. It begs the question, how do we navigate situations where the law tells us one thing, but our moral compass tells us another?
One of the most complex fields for ethical dilemmas is healthcare. Doctors often face impossible choices. For example, in end-of-life care, should a doctor prioritize extending life at all costs, or focus on the quality of life, even if that means allowing death to come sooner? This touches on the idea of autonomy versus beneficence, respecting a patient's wishes versus doing what the medical professional believes is best.
And then there's the ethical dilemma of resource allocation. During a crisis like COVID-19, How do we decide who gets life-saving treatment when there aren't enough resources for everyone? This isn't just a question of medical ethics, but also of social justice. Who do we value more, and why?
Let's unpack those two words, autonomy and beneficence. Autonomy refers to the right of individuals to make their own decisions. In a medical context, it means a patient has the right to refuse treatment, even if it could save their life. Beneficence, on the other hand, is about doing good, acting in the patient's best interest. But what happens when those two principles clash?
It's a classic ethical dilemma. For example, a patient might refuse life-saving treatment for religious reasons. Should their autonomy be respected, even if it leads to death? Or should the healthcare provider override their wishes for the sake of beneficence? There's no easy answer, and this is where the complexity of ethics truly comes into play.
When debating ethical dilemmas, it's essential to consider the frameworks we're operating within. For example, contractarianism argues that moral norms arise from social agreements, what society collectively decides is right. But is that always fair? Does the majority always know best?
And that's where moral relativism steps in, suggesting that morality is not universal, but rather shaped by cultural and individual perspectives. What's ethical in one society may be seen as immoral in another. This becomes particularly tricky when we talk about global ethical standards, such as human rights.
As we wrap up today's episode, we want to leave you with one final thought. Ethical dilemmas don't have easy answers, and they shouldn't. The very act of grappling with them makes us more empathetic, more thoughtful, and ultimately more human.
So, the next time you're faced with an ethical dilemma, whether it's at work, in a relationship, or just within yourself, pause, reflect, and ask yourself not just what the right decision is, but what kind of person you want to be as a result of that decision.
We hope today's discussion has sparked something deeper in you. Keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, there's beauty in the complexity of ethics.
Thanks for listening. Stay curious, stay critical, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.